Very good evening to all of you friends. Radhe Radhe. In this particular video, we are going to learn about the transport of gases. How these gases, oxygen and CO2, is going to transport from your lungs to the tissues, and how CO2 is transported from tissues to lungs. In this particular video, we are going to only talk about the transport of oxygen. In the next video, we will be making separate video on the transport of CO2. So first of all, we will discuss how the CO2 and oxygen will be transported from your alveoli to the tissues, and how much quantity and the concentration of oxygen is transported in which form. So first of all, friends, let's talk about the O2. So the 97% of O2 is transported by RBC. Okay, so the amount of, suppose you are taking 100 ml of oxygen, so 97 ml will be transported by RBC only. RBCs are carrying the hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin is helping the oxygen transport, and the 7% of oxygen will be transported by in dissolved state, by plasma. So this is first thing you have to remember about oxygen. Not 7, sorry, my bad, 3%. Remaining 3% will be transported by the plasma. Then CO2 about 20 to 25% CO2 will be transported by the RBC. Okay, then the 70% will be in the form of bicarbonate ion, and 7% is transported by in dissolved state, in dissolved state by plasma. So these uh, concentrations you have to remember, or these numbers you have to remember, how much of percent is transported in how much, which in which form. Okay, so let's talk about the oxygen first. Friends, oxygen, we all know that oxygen forms a binds to the hemoglobin. Whenever that oxygen goes by the process of diffusion through alveoli to the blood, when oxygen comes in blood, it goes into the 97% of oxygen goes into the RBC, and RBCs are carrying the red color pigment called hemoglobin. So suppose this is RBC, and RBC is carrying hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is a red color pigment, that's why our blood is having the red color, and one molecule of hemoglobin can bind to the four molecules of oxygen. So suppose oxygen is coming into the RBC. So one molecule oxygen is binding here, then second will bind here, then third will bind here, and fourth will bind here. So now we will call this molecule oxyhemoglobin. So this is oxygen plus hemoglobin is equal to oxyhemoglobin. Hemoglobin. And this binding is depend on so many factors, like the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of CO2, the temperature, and the hydrogen ion concentration present in that particular area. Suppose partial pressure of oxygen is very high. Suppose what is the favorable condition for O2 binding with hemoglobin? The partial pressure of oxygen should be high so that hemoglobin can bind to the oxygen. Then the partial pressure of CO2 should be low because it is having greater affinity to the hemoglobin. So if the partial pressure of CO2 is high, then CO2 will bind to the oxygen, CO2 will bind to the hemoglobin. So that should not be the case. Then the hydrogen ion concentration also should be the low in concentration. Then temperature should be also low. Then and then only oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin. Okay, so these things you have to remember. Then for the which is the favorable condition for CO2, binding with hemoglobin, that is the PCO2 should be high, partial pressure of CO2 should be high, partial pressure of O2 should be low, hydrogen ion concentration should be high, temperature should be high. Then and then only CO2 will bind to the oxygen. So these two things you have to remember. Further things I will discuss after erasing this. Let's have a pause here. So welcome back again, friends. So in this topic we will discuss about the transport of oxygen only. Transport of oxygen. And what is oxygen dissociation curve? Dissociation curve. So we all know that the favorable conditions for the favorable conditions for the sorry, it's all mess, so it's fine. Shit. The favorable conditions should be for the oxygen binding, that PCO2 should be PO2 should be high, PO2 PCO2 should be low, temperature should be low, hydrogen ion concentration should be low. But see, the molecule of hemoglobin, suppose it will require a lots of PO2 concentration, partial pressure, for to molecule to bind one molecule of O2 here. But once one molecule of O2 binds to the hemoglobin, it will require lesser quantity, lesser partial pressure uh, than this to bind second molecule of O2. I will tell you in the analogy of the time. Let's say first molecule is um, first to bind first molecule of O2 to hemoglobin, it is 1 minute is required. Then there will be less time required, less partial pressure required to bind second molecule of O2. To for the binding of third molecule, it will require much more less quantity of PO2, and for the fourth it will require much more less quantity of partial pressure of oxygen. So first is suppose first molecule of O2 is binding with hemoglobin, it is requiring lots of PO2, but once it binds to the hemoglobin, second molecule require less quantity, less time and less partial pressure of O2. So this thing can be plotted on the graph like this. So on the y-axis and on the x-axis we will be taking partial pressure of O2 in mmHg, and on the y-axis we are taking the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with O2. So suppose we will be plotting from 0 to 20 to 40 to 60 to 80. Here we will again by 20, 40, 60, 80. So for the saturation of 20%, it is requiring 20 mmHg partial pressure. But for the saturation of 40% hemoglobin to oxygen, it will not require 40 partial pressure. You can see it will reach 40% much before the 40 partial pressure. Then it will reach much before the 60% of saturation, before the 60 mmHg, and it will reach again 80% much before the 80, and you will get the curve like this. And this is the sigmoid curve you get whenever the partial pressure of oxygen is plotted against the saturation or percentage saturation of the hemoglobin with the oxygen, and this is called the oxygen dissociation curve. I hope it is helpful to you and it is understood clearly now. One more thing you have to remember here, the every 5 ml of oxygen will be transported by 100 ml of blood from lungs to the tissues. this one thing you have to remember regarding this topic. So we will meet in the next video by studying about the transport of CO2. Till then, thank you so much for you watch this video. Please, if you find this video helpful, share this video with your friends. Thank you so much.